Hello, everyone, and welcome to The God-Shaped Hole in Our Politics, a dialogue between Matt Kaemingk and Shadi Hamid. I'm excited for you guys all to be here. For those on the Zoom, we do have a live audience, a couple here at JBU. So here in the Barry Performing Arts Center, we have some people, and also in the Simmons Great Hall. I would say it's a full house, but with COVID-19, no houses are full right now. So we just say welcome to all of you. And do note that if Dr. Posey and I are on our phones up here, it's because we're communicating with one another and also with the participants of the Zoom. And do note also that there's a Slido for you guys to submit questions. Just for a little roadmap of the event, we will have some dialogue with pre-prepared questions that Dr. Posey and Kevin Singer will be asking our participants, and then you guys are all free to submit questions via that Slido. The link is all the information. Just to remind you, the event code for the link is 17609 for the Slido. And I'll give it over to Dr. Posey and Kevin to introduce themselves.
Hey everyone, my name is Kevin Singer. I am co-founder and director of Neighborly Faith. I'll tell you about Neighborly Faith in just a second, but I just want to start by saying I'm so thrilled about this event. I think this conversation is super important right now, especially as we deeply consider what exactly is the relationship between the politics that are demanding more and more of our lives and the deeply held beliefs that we bring to our politics. And so excited to be a part of this and excited to introduce my co-moderator, Dr. Tricia Posey.
Hi, everyone. My name is Tricia Posey, and I am director of the honors program here at JBU and also professor of history. And I am so thrilled to be part of this event as well. I think we're going to have a great discussion this evening, and I'm looking forward to our discussion.
Awesome. So I'm going to take a second to introduce Neighborly Faith. Neighborly Faith promotes constructive exchanges between Christians and Muslims, but really between Christians and people of all faiths. This week, Neighborly Faith has brought speakers to classes across John Brown University campus, to promote a better understanding and communication between Christians and Muslims, and everyone has been invited to join that conversation. To see a full calendar events of everything that we're doing at John Brown University this week, which most of those events are open to the public, you can head over to www.neighborlyfaith.org or follow us on Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook. We love interacting with our followers.
And speaking for JBU, I'm just so thankful for the opportunity that we've had to have Neighborly Faith on campus this week. Just this morning, I had Greg Howe talking to my Gateway class, and it was an enormous privilege to have him in my class. And as Kevin said, we have many other events on campus this week, so do pay attention to the other events and plan to attend some of those if you can.
Yeah, I was able to be a part of that conversation with Greg Howe from InterVarsity Christian Fellowship, who just really helps students think about what it means to be good neighbors in this very diverse society in which we now live. I want to take a moment to actually thank some really great partners that have really helped to make the events this week awesome. And that is Dr. Daniel Bennett, who is professor of political science and co-director of the Center for Faith and Flourishing there at John Brown University. Without Dr. Bennett, Dr. Vila, Isaac, Dr. Posey, and so many others, none of this really would have been possible. So I just want to give a shout out to the Center for Faith and Flourishing for the amazing partnership that we've had putting all of this together this week. So without further ado, we are going to introduce our speakers tonight. And Dr. Posey will start by introducing Matt Kaemingk.
Yeah, it's my privilege to introduce Matthew Kaemingk. He was our chapel speaker this morning and will also be speaking in chapel on Thursday. So you'll recognize his face if you were in chapel today. He's Associate Dean and Assistant Professor of Christian Ethics at Fuller Seminary, Texas, and author of the award-winning book, Christian Hospitality and Muslim Immigration in an Age of Fear. Since the book's release, Matthew has traveled to dozens of Christian colleges across the country to promote honest and gracious conversation with Muslims.
Yeah, Matt's a great friend of our organization. One thing we've always loved about Matt is the ability he has to mix truth with grace. And this morning, I think we saw a really great example of that when he talked about the hijab and Christian hospitality. I thought it was just a terrific presentation. It's my great honor to introduce Shadi Hamid, who's also a great friend of our organization. Shadi is senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, and at Brookings, he writes about several topics, including Islam and foreign policy, Islam and politics. He's a very widely respected scholar and author. He writes frequently for The Atlantic, which is a very popular press outlet. He's written several books, including Islamic Exceptionalism, How the Struggle Over Islam is Reshaping the World, that was published in 2016, and Temptations of Power, which was published in 2014. Shadi is a widely respected thinker and writer among Christians and Muslims and across the political spectrum. And as if that isn't enough, Shadi received a PhD from Oxford, and he has his own Wikipedia page. So just keep that in mind, that the caliber of speakers we have tonight is quite impressive. So now we're going to introduce the theme of the evening, a God-shaped hole in our politics.
So tonight we're going to have a discussion about how our most deeply held religious beliefs can help us understand the current challenges facing American democracy.
Yeah, in this unique moment in American life, it really seems like politics is everything, perhaps more than politics was ever meant to be. Can religious faith protect us from giving politics too much power over us? And can our belief systems give us the resources to navigate our deepest differences and disagreements without inducing violence toward one another?
So this discussion will give a Christian and a Muslim who happen to be great friends an opportunity to reflect critically on our political discourse and the future of democracy.
In a moment when our politics threaten to be the only thing that matters, Matt and Shadi imagine a better path, one where religious people actually steward politics, not the other way around. So, with that being said, welcome Matthew and Shadi to John Brown University, to this discussion. We've got tons of people in the audience. So excited to hear you guys chat. So again, thanks for being here. Thanks for giving your time and expertise to this discussion. All right, so Matt, you suggested this question, so I'm just going to go straight into it. The theme is not your typical discussion question. The God-shaped hole in our politics. Frankly, I think people are more accustomed to talking about how faith doesn't talk enough about politics. So what does the theme mean to you? And Matt, why don't we go ahead and start with you?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. First of all, it is tremendous to be connected with John Brown University. I was so looking forward to being physically with all of you, and just deep thanks to Neighborly Faith and the whole John Brown team for pulling this together. The God-shaped hole in our politics. I think there were a couple things going on in my head when I said, Shadi, this sounds like a good idea. I think it's very common for political pundits to remark on how divisive American politics are, about how cynical politics are, about how harsh they can be. And I think what I would say is that I think one thing that is missing from our understanding of what is happening in American politics today is that we might be able to describe our politics as actually becoming increasingly religious. Increasingly, we might say existential in how we are approaching our politics. And by that, I mean, American politics are becoming increasingly about matters that are ultimate, that are cosmic. They're about our very identity. They increasingly feel like a religious contestation, as opposed to, when I was younger, I was a political science major, and I used to watch C-SPAN on television. And there were sort of very dull policy debates going on in C-SPAN about tax policy and whatnot. But today, politics is not boring at all. It's quite cataclysmic, apocalyptic in its feel. And so the first thing that I was thinking about in choosing this theme was actually talking about how deeply religious our political engagements are becoming. The other side is increasingly becoming seen as profoundly evil. The other side is an existential threat to our identities, to our ways of life, to our bodies. And so that's the first thing I think about. But I'm sure Shadi has something to add there.
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. Good to be with you. So just to piggyback on what Matt said, so I was living in the Middle East during the Arab Spring. And back then, I thought the Middle East was different in the sense that Arabs, whether it was Egyptians, Tunisians, whatever, they were going through these revolutions and they were divided over foundational questions, over the meaning of the nation state, over the role of Islam in everyday life, the relationship between Islam and the state. And for me as an American who was in the Middle East, this felt foreign to me because in my own country here in the US, I was more used to debates over policy. So back in the good old days, I don't know if you guys remember when Barack Obama was president, we used to debate kind of seemingly minor things like healthcare policy or tax policy. I mean, we still debate them, but that's not the main thrust of our politics today. But back then, there seemed to be a contrast between the US and the Middle East. In the Middle East, they were debating existential questions, the most personal, raw things that you could possibly imagine. I mean, what is more personal than one's relationship to God? In the US, it seemed like we were just a normal advanced democracy and we were past the foundational questions. Fast forward 8 or 9 years to 2020, and in some ways we've caught up to the Middle East. And now the gap between them isn't as large as it once was. And just think about the election. I guess when was that? It feels like forever ago, but I guess that was 7 days ago. Yes. Did anyone, most people did not vote for Biden or Donald Trump for specific policy reasons. It was about competing ways of life. It was about how we understood our nation, what it meant to be American. It was about what seemed to be completely divergent paths for the future of our country. And that's why the stakes felt so high. And that's why it seems to be hard for people to accept the result if they lost. And I'm sure if it had turned out the other way around, if Biden had lost, I imagine that Democrats would have had trouble accepting the legitimacy of that result too. Why? Because this isn't normal politics. It feels like everything is at stake and it feels personally threatening to us. And I remember in 2016, the first time that, I guess for the first and only time Donald Trump won, at least as far as we can tell, that election felt unusually existential for me as an American Muslim. I remember during the campaign when Trump was talking about the proposed Muslim ban, and then after that, when he actually won, we would have conversations in the Muslim community about how we felt that this could be a personal threat. I mean, God forbid if if a terrorist attack happened and then anti-Muslim sentiment increased, what would the Trump administration do? That sort of thing. So those are the kind of existential questions that I think everyone is feeling now. No matter what you are or which side you're on, you're worried that your future is going to be affected in a fundamentally bad, if not, or worse than bad way if the other side wins. And I think we have to, and what we're talking about today is that we have to find a way to dial that back down and return politics to its proper place. Politics should not be a substitute religion. And we can talk more about what the God-shaped hole actually means. I'll just say very briefly that what we've seen in this country is a precipitous fall in religious identification and religious practice. So Christianity has declined, and it's no longer the common culture that most Americans share. There's more and more atheists, agnostics, so-called nuns who don't belong to a traditional organized religion. And we might have thought that with the decline of traditional religion in America, that we could become a more pluralistic, tolerant place because religion is seen as a problem because it's very existential. But what we've had instead is that the decline of Christianity and decline of religion has not necessarily led to a more pluralistic country. I would argue the opposite has happened. In the past 10 to 15 years, we've become more polarized, more divided. So that's a puzzle that I just want to pose there, and we can talk about that more. As religion has declined, polarization has gone up. I don't think that's by accident.
So a follow-up question for both of you. One of the common themes in your answer to that first question was that it didn't used to be this way, that in the last few years, what we've seen is this move toward politics being more focused on those existential questions. So one question I have for both of you is, what changed? Why this shift, would you say?
So to speak directly to Shadi's comment about sort of the precipitous death of institutional religion does have something to do with that. And I think there are a number of reasons for that. One is what religion provides humanity with is a sense of identity, a sense of mission, a sense of purpose, a sense of belonging and community. If you are a part of a mosque or a church or a synagogue, you're a part of a community in which you can participate and you can know and be known by other people. And so when you no longer have that community, a number of things can start to happen with you. First of all, you start to look for meaning and purpose and identity in other things. And politics provides a great sense of meaning and purpose to people. You have this sense of, whether it be justice or equality or a sort of ethnic identity that you would like to sort of project onto the nation. Politics is very thrilling in that you can feel very heroic in politics, sort of vanquishing a great cosmic enemy. And so when we lose our religious identity within an institution, we start to look for that meaning and purpose elsewhere. But on top of that, we start to look for belonging elsewhere. So we could go onto social media and make a political declaration, and our people will rally around us. And so that gives us this sense of belonging and meaning and purpose. And for people who are lonely, who are no longer connected to a traditional institutional community, social media declarations around politics provide a sense of moral meaning and belonging. That's very thrilling. There's something exciting about that. There's much more to be said, but I'll turn it over to Shadi on that.
Yeah, sure. I mean, there was an assumption that, as modernization proceeded, as we became more advanced in various societies, that we would lose the need for this ultimate meaning, and that we could just content ourselves with doing whatever we want to do, whether it's seeking pleasure, family, friends would be enough, enjoyment, enjoying leisure time, luxury, whatever it might be, as economic standards went up and as people's living standards went up, that they wouldn't need religion, this idea that religion was a crutch. But, so this is why this debate revolves around what our starting premises are about human nature. I think that account of human nature turned out to be wrong. We need meaning. And even for those of us who aren't religious, you don't have to be religious to know what that feeling feels like, that something might be missing in your own life, or you might want something deeper and then you look for it. And there's a number of different options, but all of these things help fill what is essentially a religious impulse. Now, for those of us who believe in God, we would argue that God instilled into us this desire for ultimate meaning. But even if you don't believe in God, you could still make an argument that for biological reasons and evolutionary purposes, humans, just as a factual matter, they desire meaning, and we can look and we can see that all around us. So just think about the things like things that might seem silly. And we talked about politics, which is important. I don't think it's the most important thing, but that's one thing that can give people meaning. But then there are other things like meditation or yoga or your spin cycle class or a reading group with your friends where you read a book every day, every week. There's a number of things that help provide, that help fill the gap, if there is in fact a gap. But the problem is when a lot of those desires get shifted to politics, then basically we're making politics into a religious struggle. And that's where it becomes problematic. And we see certain examples of this with what might be called the woke movement. I don't mean to use that disparagingly, but that's often how it's described. And this focus on progressive politics, where it's all about fighting for equality, which is great. I think most of us on this panel or on this event would agree. But when that becomes the ultimate end, and that the victory has to be found in this life, and 100% equality in every aspect of life has to be found now, and first of all, it's not realistic. And we can talk about the role of sin, that there's always going to be a certain level of imperfection in this world. So when you start to strive for perfection, you want it now and you won't accept anything less. First of all, it's unrealistic, but also it can push people to pursue utopian ends. And when people think that they are on the absolute side of righteousness, it can lead them to overreach and to harm other people in the name of justice.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing that, Shadi. I want to bring sort of a different angle on this. So I know there's a lot of people during this election cycle who have argued that, one thing we've learned perhaps in the last few years during the Trump administration is that everything we say and do is somehow political. Like there's no way we can get away from anything we do publicly being a political act or political speak. And this, of course, can feel really intimidating and really exhausting, that there's absolutely nothing I can say or do as a person, as a citizen, that does not either show people what my politics are, good or bad, or do something politically to someone else. So the question I have is, with sort of that exhausting sort of cycle in mind, is religious faith, whether it be Muslim or Christian, when we say we're gonna put faith back in its proper place, is that actually a cop-out, though, where we're saying we don't want our actions and our behavior and our speech to have political ramifications, so we're going to sort of back out of that responsibility and retreat perhaps into our religious faith? So is it a cop-out, or is it that religious faith is really an antidote when politics tries to rule our lives? Because I feel like I personally identify with both of those perspectives. And I feel like so far we've really focused on the latter, that religious faith can be an antidote to politics being too much. But what about those who would say religion is actually trying to minimize us taking responsibility for even the ways that our religious faith has perpetuated political violence against others?
Matt, you want to take that to start at least?
All right, I'll go for it. So two things. You'll notice that Shadi and I are playing with the word religion quite a lot. And I would say that's because it needs to be played with, because it's a very complex word that can get you into a lot of trouble. But I will speak as a Christian, as a member of what we call the Christian religion, I suppose. And I would say that Christians are very much in danger of falling onto either side, of sort of running away from politics and ignoring their political responsibility. They are also very much in danger of weaponizing their faith within politics. So both of those things, and I could point to numerous historical examples of this, and I could point to numerous examples of this from last week. But what I would say is that for me, as a Christian and as a theologian, I find within my Christian faith a profound resource to put politics in its place. So to the person who would say to me, everything is political, I would reply that everything might have an aspect of power to it. But there is more to human life than politics and power struggle. There is art, there's music, there's family, there's sports, science, history, games. The God of the Christian faith made human beings to be complex cultural creatures. And when you reduce everything to politics and power struggle, you have a very narrow, myopic, and frankly, very sad way of looking at life. And that way of life just simply does not account for the complexity of what it means to be human. And so, in the New Testament, Jesus says that I have come that they might have life and have it to the full. And I take that to mean that Christ came not to sort of rescue us from this life, rescue us out of political responsibility, but he also came to give us a fullness of life. So he did not simply come to give us justice, though justice is certainly a gift that Jesus gives us. But he came to give us joy and community and meals and play and family. And all of that is part of the Christian life. And so to narrow the human life or the Christian life down to politics and power struggle, and particularly the imminent power struggle that we find in tribal politics and identity politics, and I'm speaking about both the left and the right here, it is too narrow and sad a way of thinking about human life and human community. And what my own Christian faith does for me is it opens up life to see that it is more than simply sort of this existential struggle of power.
Yeah. So to your question, Kevin, I think that there's a caveat here. I mean, my argument isn't that we should stop caring about politics. I think all of us should be as politically engaged as we can be or comfortable being. What I'm arguing instead is that we should care about politics, but in a different way. And I'll try to explain what I mean by that. I think, first of all, and just to give a personal example, since I'm the Muslim in this dialogue with a Christian, so Matt actually, through his writing and through our conversations, introduced me to some Christian concepts which have influenced my approach to politics. Maybe I'll just share that in case it's of interest. In particular, he introduced me to the work of a Dutch theologian, Abraham Kuyper, who I've become a very big fan of. And Kuyper was one of the major exponents of something called Christian pluralism, drawing on his Calvinist background. And Kuyper was alive in the 19th and early 20th century. And the argument that Kuyper made, and the argument that Matt has made to me, is that if we look at this life as a site of imperfection, and why is it imperfect? Because perfection is only possible with Christ, and until Christ returns, that there is this inherent sinfulness that is part of the human experience. And if we take that as a starting premise, it means that we have to be humble about what we can know in this world. If we are all fallen and broken by sin, it means that we can strive to understand God's will, but there will always be an inability to truly reach any kind of perfect understanding. And what that means is, what does it mean to be humble then? And how do we apply that to politics? That goes back to this question of, where do we find final victories? If final victories are not in this world, in this life, because of that imperfection, it means basically that we suspend or postpone judgment until the next life. So there is a final judgment, but it's not to be had in the here and now. What that does, it opens up the possibilities of living with deep difference. Because if judgment comes only from God later on, perhaps quite a bit later on, it means that it's not our job as human beings to offer final judgment, even if we really don't like our political opponents. So take, for example, here in the US, I would argue that, so I'm not a Trump supporter, but for Trump supporters, they are not my enemy. They are fellow Americans, and therefore they are within the fold. This language where we try to say the other side are deplorables, they're irredeemable, they're all racist, they're all bigots, that to me is unacceptable, because it's essentially saying that we are trying to offer a very decisive judgment against our fellow citizens. Now, there are the 1% to 2% of the population that are open, avowed racists and white supremacists, but here I'm talking about the 98% of normal people who are not that. And I want to be able to broaden the range of what's possible and what's acceptable. And so what that means, every day, if you meet someone who you're like, your initial instinct is, this person is terrible, this person is racist, you try to take a step back and say, I'm going to try to suspend that. I can disagree strongly with that person, but I'm not going to say that they are irredeemable, because, in some sense, everyone is redeemable.
Shadi, does that come from a Muslim perspective that you have? Like, where does that arise from?
It comes from Matt. I'm joking. No, I mean, so in this case, I'm sharing a sort of Christian account based on my friendship with Matt and our conversations, and also the work of Abraham Kuyper. I should add, though, as I started looking at some of these issues more, I tried to find parallels in my own faith tradition in Islam. And I'm actually doing some more work now on trying to develop an idea of Islamic pluralism and trying to look at different precedents in the Islamic legal tradition for similar conclusions. And what you find is that there is quite a bit of that. In Islam, we don't have quite the same emphasis on the brokenness of man and being fallen by sin. That's obviously a distinctly Christian concept. But one example is that throughout Islamic history, including many, many centuries ago, you would have Islamic legal scholars, they would give a religious edict. And what they would traditionally do, and what many still do to this very day, they would end their religious ruling with the words Allahu Alam, which means, and only God knows. Now, we say this as a kind of pro forma thing in the modern Muslim world now, but this comes from, if you look at it closely, a very deep place in the Islamic tradition. What it means is that even people who have spent decades studying the word of God and the scripture and the corpus of Islamic law, they still acknowledge that they can't know for certain that they're right. So they end every opinion with a declaration of epistemological and intellectual humility. Another example in Islam is there is a prophetic hadith where if a Muslim strives for the truth and they get it wrong, if a Muslim strives for the truth and they get it right, they get 2 bounties from God. If a Muslim strives for the truth but gets it wrong because we're imperfect, then that person gets 1 bounty. So there's no punishment, there's no problem in getting things wrong, as long as you approach it with good faith intent and you're trying your best to discern what God's will is. It's good to be right, but a lot of the time we human beings will not be right, but you're still going to be rewarded by God.
I might just quickly say that it's important for all of the Christians in the audience to recognize something that Shadi just did, which was he is showing profound curiosity in another religious tradition. He is taking time to listen and learn and even be able to use and apply that faith. And so I would ask my fellow Christian brothers and sisters, are you curious about Islam? Are you interested in reading their texts and learning about them? Because what Shadi has just modeled for us is a profound curiosity about a faith identity that is different from his own. And in order for pluralistic democracy to work, we need more citizens like that. So I just wanted to mention that.
To extend this idea, Shadi, you've talked a lot about the way that theology and the way we think about faith can shape the way we think about politics. So I'd like to hear both you and Matt talk a little more about how theological categories like human sin, divine sovereignty, and also faith-driven virtues like mercy, justice, and humility inform and even inspire our political engagement. You've answered this a little bit, but I'd like to hear more on this question specifically.
Okay, I guess I'll start. So I think that one problem that we see in modern American politics is that you have sin without redemption, or you have sin and only punishment. So think about cancel culture, for example, to use that phrase. And, cancel culture has been a problem on some campuses, hopefully not yours. But you have this issue where if someone says something wrong, even if they intend to be respectful and understanding, but they don't know the right language to use on a certain issue, and then that becomes a big controversy, and they might try to apologize or add context or whatever it might be, but that person, it will take a very long time, if ever, for that person to come back in the good graces of the movement for justice. And in that sense, religion has a conception of sin, but it also has a conception of redemption and forgiveness. And, obviously, many of you are Christians, you'll know that that's very important in the Christian faith. In Islam, there is punishment. Punishment is an important part of, I would say, most, at least the monotheistic faiths to some extent. But one thing that I think all of us grew up in, at least in my Muslim community, was these stories and hadith of the Prophet and things like that, that really emphasize this idea that no matter how much bad you did, no matter how many sins you committed, there was always a way out through God and through worship and through prayer, that no one was beyond the pale. Even if you committed one of the greatest sins, if you turned to God, you could find redemption. And that's a very powerful idea that you don't have in modern political movements. And that's why, what I say sometimes is if you want to do religion, do religion. The problem with taking religious impulses and doing them in the very narrow area of everyday politics, what ends up happening is that you mimic the certainty and conviction of religion, but without the good or the best attributes of religion to kind of temper that sense of conviction and certainty. And that's what you need sometimes. Now, we should be straight up about this. Unfortunately, in our respective faiths, we have a lot of people who don't necessarily model this intellectual humility. They believe they are right and everyone else is wrong. And sometimes that can lead to religious violence. So we also have to try to understand why in our own faiths, there's a big gap between the theory that we're laying out right now and the practice. And all of us should try in our everyday lives to close that gap. And we just got to be straight up about that. That's a real problem. But at least what religion offers, both, since that's what we're focusing on right now, Islam and Christianity, I would argue, both offer certainty and righteousness tempered by a necessary dose of humility.
Yeah, so you mentioned the importance of virtues, and I think that there is a growing consensus amongst political scientists and democratic theorists, a sort of growing realization that democracy is not simply a system of government with voting and laws and structures, but democracy is a bit of a way of life that requires certain habits and virtues within its citizens. Eventually your side is going to lose in a democracy, and you have to accept the result of losing. And this requires certain virtues like patience, humility, faith, tolerance. And the challenge for modern democracies is that governments are actually quite terrible at producing virtues. So they depend upon these democratic virtues, but states have a difficult time producing them. And traditionally in the Christian faith and the Islamic faith, the place where virtues are developed are within the faith community and within the family. That is where we learn to, around the dinner table is where we learn to take our turn to say please and thank you and listen to others and have a conversation. I just had somewhat of that experience tonight with my 3 sons who sometimes succeed at saying please and thank you. But it's within the church, frankly, that we are disciplined and trained into the faith, where we practice confessing our sins weekly, where we are given an assurance of pardon that we have been forgiven, but we are always being reminded of our own sin and brokenness. And so we can't go more than a week without being reminded of that brokenness. And so done correctly, worship and prayer develops within us certain postures. And as I said, governments struggle to develop citizens who have these certain postures and virtues. And so that does create a challenge. Yeah.
I'm gonna hit our last question, then we'll jump into Q&A. I thought we'd end by asking both of you to be a bit introspective for a moment about your own faith community speech and behavior during the 2020 election cycle. So Matt, we're going to ask you to think about perhaps the evangelical Christian community, and Shadi, perhaps the Muslim community. What did faith leaders in your tradition get right, and what did they get wrong? What do you hope that leaders in your faith tradition will do differently in this next season of American life? And Matt, I'm going to go ahead and start with you, if you don't mind.
Yeah, I've been wrestling with this one. In many ways, it feels too soon. I feel like I need more time to process this. I think that as an evangelical Christian, this has been a really hard year. It's been a really hard 4 years to watch. I grew up in a evangelical Protestant home and was told that character really matters, that truth really matters. I was told that God cares about truth telling, and that we should elect leaders who care about those things, and to watch the weaponization of my faith, to go after marginalized, weak people is pretty hard. So it's been a hard year for me. However, I would say that amongst my generation of evangelicals, there are a number of profound and exciting points of excitement. People of deep evangelical faith who are engaged in public and political issues, who really do care about seeking justice for all. So I serve as a fellow at the Center for Public Justice, which is a Christian organization in Washington, D.C., which fights for the religious freedom of all people and wants to generously seek public justice for all, not just for Christians. Neighborly Faith, the organization that is hosting this, cares deeply about equipping evangelical Christians to be good and generous neighbors to those that they disagree with. The AND campaign is another tremendous campaign, which is trying to help Christians think in more thoughtful, charitable ways about others in politics. And so there are points of light. There's much more to be said, but I would say that, you know, this has been a hard year, and I think that it's important to continue to reflect upon our own faith and the ways in which we speak. You know, I think that I work at a seminary, and so we train pastors, and I interact with pastors quite a lot. And I have heard so many times this year, a pastor will tell me in private, you know, I have historically felt so proud of my church and so proud of my people and the way that they are studying scripture and following Jesus. And I felt excited to watch them grow in the faith. And then I go on social media and I watch their behavior. And I just think to myself, oh my goodness, they have been shaped more by cable news than by the gospel. They have been shaped more by talk radio than scripture. They sound more like political pundits than like Amos and Isaiah and Paul. And so the ways in which our faith community, personally, I'm reflecting a lot on the issue of political formation and how Christians are being formed by secular political voices in the world, as opposed to the person of Jesus and the peace and the sacrificial love and hospitality that he calls us to. So those are some of the things that I'm reflecting on right now.
Yeah, so what Matt just discussed is how politics is shaping and even perhaps distorting religion in his own faith community. And obviously, preferably, it should be the other way around, right? We have a similar problem, but it's almost in the opposite direction, that American Muslims have increasingly become an integral part of the Democratic Party. And that has, in both direct and indirect ways, had a liberalizing effect on American Muslims. So there's some fascinating polling. To give one example, on gay acceptance of gay marriage. In a 2007 poll, only 27% of American Muslims were supportive. 10 years later, the number had jumped up to 52%. And that tells you something, that young Muslims in this country, because we are becoming more and more part of the left and drifting away from the Republican Party. I remember my parents in 2000, when I was younger, quite young, they voted for George W. Bush. That was pretty much the last time a majority or plurality of Muslims voted for a Republican, right? So we've seen a very striking shift. Now, if you like the idea of American Muslims becoming more liberal, then this is a good development. However, I think that we have to be a little bit cautious here. And I think that if you look at some of the early, not just exit polling results, but also kind of post-election surveys, there was a fascinating survey that came out from AP Votecast the other day that as many as 35% of American Muslims voted for Donald Trump. Now, this is remarkable because the number, according to polls in 2016, was around 10 to 15%. So this is if these numbers are correct, this would be a massive increase. And we have to, I think, ask ourselves, did this liberalizing push where American Muslims embrace the Democratic Party, and in return, Democrats to some extent maybe took us for granted? We didn't think that anything was at play. But what I've noticed in recent years is that there's a minority of American Muslims who have been grumbling about some of these developments. We don't hear them much because they don't have access to mainstream media. The people who are in the public eye, those American Muslims tend to be more liberal and more leaning to the left. And I think we've lost sight that there's still a big chunk of the American Muslim population that is worried about questions like religious liberty, of traditional family values, so on and so forth. And I think that the Democratic Party, if it's willing to learn, should realize that becoming a thoroughly secularized party, which I would argue the Democratic Party has become, has its drawbacks. And as a Democrat and as a liberal myself, I want to see my own party being less hostile to communities and people of faith, and to go out of its way to try to say, hey, if you're a believer, if you're a Christian, a conservative Christian, a traditional Christian, traditional Muslim, there is a place for you in this party. So I think there's a lot of lessons that can be learned there.
Thank you, Shadi. We have some really great student questions coming in, and I want to encourage you to continue to send your questions in. What's our event code again, Isaac? Do you know it? The event code for Slido?
It's 17609. If you go to slido.com, you can type in that event code and ask your question.
Okay, thanks, Kevin.
Yep.
So I'm gonna ask the first student question that we have here. And the first question is, what is the greatest thing American Christians fear about Muslims? And what is the greatest thing American Muslims fear about Christians?
Is this one for me? Yeah. I would say that American Christians generally, in my experience, when I speak on these issues, it's normally a contest between security fears around terrorism, and then cultural fears around cultural and religious, frankly, that Muslims represent a threat to American culture and a threat to the Christian faith. And then there's normally some kind of talk about Sharia law coming to be imposed on them. Those tend to be the common concerns that I receive.
So the common concerns that I receive or that I hear are a kind of distorted view of Christians in America, and particularly evangelicals more broadly, where people will ask, well, why are committed Christians so seemingly anti-Muslim or Islamophobic? Now, obviously, this is a stereotype and an overgeneralization. Unfortunately, however, there is quite a bit of polling that evangelicals report disproportionately high anti-Muslim attitudes. I mean, unfortunately, and I mean, it's not.
Shadi, we're number one when it comes to Islamophobia. Let's just say that way. We are number one.
Okay, there you go. So I think there's a lot of confusion where, especially if you're a conservative Muslim who is traditional in practice, you might look to your fellow conservative Christians and say, hey, we share certain things on abortion, on gay marriage, on family values, on not having an overly secularized culture, of being comfortable with the place of God in public life, that can be a positive thing. So from their standpoint, that can lead to confusion where they say, well, why isn't there more common ground? And instead, there's a sense that there's a lot of panic over things which, like from a Muslim standpoint, seem a little bit odd, like fears of Sharia taking over. I understand where that comes from. If you follow the violence and extremism in the Middle East and you worry that might be replicated in the US context, but Muslims are only 1% of the US population. There's not really a lot of us. And most of us, as I just mentioned earlier, are more on the liberal side and becoming less religiously conservative over time. And so to think that Muslims are preparing some plot to overtake America, it sounds to us a little bit odd. And it's hard for us to understand where that really comes from, because the focus shouldn't be on like what you hear in the Middle East. And sure, sometimes there is the imposition of Sharia law in certain Muslim majority countries, but American Muslims should be understood on their own terms as American Muslims. And to understand that particular context, I assume some of it is that most evangelicals don't actually have Muslim friends or hang out with Muslims. And in the parts of the country where evangelicals are most predominant, there are less Muslims. So it's hard to actually find them like in the flesh, which makes it easier to develop these stereotypes.
As a follow-up question, I'd like to hear both of you talk about, Shadi, you mentioned finding common ground. How do we do that? Practically speaking, how do Christians and Muslims learn about each other and learn about what common ground exists?
Okay, so on common ground, I'm I don't necessarily think common ground is the best way to look at it. I mean, if common ground happens, great, and we can find what we have in common. I think what in some ways becomes just as important is understanding where there isn't common ground. So I'm not someone who believes in this lovey-dovey, fluffy conception of religion where we all basically believe the same thing. I think, first of all, it's simplistic. And I think it kind of overlooks the individual richness and distinctiveness of each religion. I mean, if all religions were basically the same, it wouldn't be that important whether you were Muslim or Christian, because they all basically say the same thing. Instead, what I think is important is to say, hey, there are major differences. So, for example, there are pretty big differences on Jesus. I mean, as Muslims, Jesus is one of our most revered prophets, but we do not believe he is divine. That's obviously central to Christianity. Let's talk openly about that. And I think there's also something to be said for saying, hey, we're not going to always convince the other that we're right and they're wrong. And you shouldn't necessarily go into every dialogue that you're trying to win an argument. And I've kind of given up doing that. I say, hey, we disagree on something. Let's actually talk through our disagreement so I can understand where that disagreement comes from. But we live in a pluralistic society. It's okay to live with deep difference. And I know that might sound either incredibly banal and obvious or kind of vaguely revolutionary, depending on your perspective. But that should be like a really central premise. And I'll just share a very quick anecdote about this. I was speaking at an evangelical conference in Nashville a couple of years ago, and this old fellow comes up to me after I give the talk, and he asked me, excuse me, sir, can I shake your hand? And I'm like a little bit confused. I'm like, sure. So we shake hands. Obviously, this is pre-COVID times, I guess, when you would still like meet people and shake their hands. And so I was a little bit confused, like, what's going on here? And he says to me, I really liked what you had to say and I really appreciate it. And I learned a lot. And I was kind of smiling and nodding. And then he's like, but you shouldn't get too happy there. That doesn't mean that I don't think that you basically will likely go to hell if you don't accept Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior. And so he basically kind of shifted to trying to tell me that, hey, like you're still in dangerous territory here, even though I enjoyed your talk. But you know what? Instead of taking offense, I actually found that really refreshing because we continued talking. That's a theological conviction that he has. And that is one of the mainstream positions. We have that in Islam as well, where some Muslims will say that, the other side may not be granted salvation. That's not personally my view, but it is a view that's out there and it's in the mainstream. But we were able to talk about that and respect each other. And I should know, one of the reasons he wanted to shake my hand, he told me that I was the first Muslim he had ever really talked to like in his life and shaken hands with. And that's why he wanted to sort of solidify that with a kind of interaction. But I think that is sort of a model of how you do deep difference. You say, okay, someone is saying that you might go to hell, but that should not stop the conversation. You should continue the conversation, even if someone thinks you're going to hell, to use an extreme example.
Yeah, so I think just to add on there, I think the reason Shadi and I aren't terribly excited or interested in the common ground question is because deep difference tends to make people very uncomfortable. And so what they do, some of them will do, is when they experience that deep difference, they want to run quickly to find something in common, because they believe the only way I can have a relationship with this person is if I find something that we have in common, right? It's not enough that we're human or they're interesting or funny or whatever. We have to find something that we believe or practice in common, and then we'll build off of that commonness, rather than really truly exploring those differences and having that be your connection. So in many ways, Shadi and I's relationship has been built off of the exploring of these differences. And at times we do find real points of agreement, and that's always exciting and nice, but we're not looking for that. And we're not fearful that our relationship will fall apart if we can't find that. And the same is true politically speaking. I have to convince you all the way down that my side is right, or all is lost, and I can't know you, and I can't love you, I can't be engaged, a common citizen with you. Rather than seeing politics as this proximate space where we compromise with people that we have deep differences with. And so that is why I would say we're cautious about this commonness. And even the discussion of the common good can be really difficult, because when one person says to you, I want to seek the common good, I want to ask back, well, whose common good are you talking about? Whose conception of the common good?
So terrific perspectives on this. Very important, I think, because most often I think we're made to think that the only way to go about these interactions is to try to manufacture common ground as quickly as we can. And so I love that perspective of let's engage the difference. The differences are what make these interactions worthwhile. I love that. However, for the sake of those who may genuinely be puzzled, how on earth Muslims and Christians, despite their disagreements and fears of one another, could work together? Just sort of a lightning round here for both of you. What would you say are some very fertile areas where, practically speaking, Muslims and evangelicals, despite their very deep differences, could actually work together in some productive way?
So I'll start off on this one with a little story from the Netherlands, because I was studying the conflict over Muslim immigration there in Europe, and particularly in the Netherlands. There were a group of, so the Netherlands is, maybe 85% secular, we would say. And then there are small Christian, Muslim, and Jewish minorities there. But it is truly dominated by more secular, progressive liberalism. And there was a group of leftist animal rights political activists who wanted to instill a law in the Netherlands that would ban kosher and halal butchers and food in the Netherlands, because they believed that Muslim and Jewish practices of cleaning meat and killing animals, they believed that it was cruel. And so they wanted to ban these things. And a very interesting thing happened at that moment, where Muslims, Jews, and Christians all came together and defended their rights for religious freedom together. And we've talked earlier about some of the commonness that conservative Christians and conservative Muslims have in terms of family values, sexuality, gender, abortion, these sorts of things. While these things we have in common today in America, you're not going to see evangelicals and Muslims partner very often right now, but I can see hope in the future of that happening as Christians begin to become more of a minority in America. So right now, Christians are still very much holding on to this belief that they can take America back for God through a form of political power, right? If we just organize enough votes, we can take America back for Jesus using politics. But as Christianity becomes smaller within America, it may realize that evangelicals may come to realize that they need Catholics and Jews and Mormons and Muslims if they would like to defend their religious faith. So that's just a few comments there.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, Matt said it right. I mean, religious freedom and religious liberty, I would say that is the number one space where there can be real deep engagement, because some of the concerns are similar. And, it's really worth noting that, I think there's a tendency on the left now to engage in a lot of self-criticism and self-disgust about how bad or evil America is, and the bad, and there are obviously evil and very bad parts of our history. However, if we're looking at America in this moment, one of the great things I would argue is our model of integration of religious minorities. And I'm I think, and this has been, I suppose, maybe it's controversial with some people, I think the best place in terms of religious freedom to be a Muslim in the world today is the United States. Because, and you look at all the other examples and the other competitors to this, and they don't really come close. I mean, look at Western Europe. Because you have a very aggressive secularism in many of these countries, public religiosity is either not encouraged or not even accepted. I mean, France, for example, if a Muslim woman wears a headscarf, she will not be accepted in certain public institutions or state institutions, and will have to basically take her headscarf off, which means she has to choose between her Muslim identity and her French identity. The American model of secularism is much more accepting, and not just obviously with Muslims, it also draws on a history where persecuted Christians could come here and express their faith fully. As long as they were operating within the law and within the democratic process, they had that freedom. And we shouldn't lose sight of that or take that for granted. That is not a very common thing in other parts of the world. However, sometimes I do worry that there is a temptation to go in this more European aggressive secularist direction. And that would be an incredible loss to what makes America great now in the present moment, which is that you can be a conservative Muslim or an ultra-Orthodox Jew or a very conservative Christian, and you can be fully American, because there's nothing about the American idea that requires you to privatize your faith or to dilute your faith.
Thank you. The next student question, and I'd like both of you to answer it. It was stated in this way, but then I'll restate it for you, Shadi. So the question is, what's the fine line between standing up for Christian truth while being firm and showing Christ's love to those we may not agree with? And then for you, Shadi, of course, what's the fine line between standing up for truth while being firm and showing love to those we may not agree with?
So you have the way in which I get this question a lot. The way in which the question is posed is, how do I be a person of deep conviction that is unmovable, but also a person of civility and kindness and love? And the question itself poses these things as in tension with one another. And the way that I would say that is that my love and civility and hospitality for those who are different from me comes directly out of scriptural truth and the identity of who Jesus is. So I am not weakening my faith by being friends with Shadi. Right? The reason I am friends with Shadi, what shapes my friendship with him, is who Jesus is for me. So Jesus is the reason why I can show grace and hospitality to my neighbors who are Muslim, who are pagan, who are Hindu. I'm not leaving Jesus to be friends with them. Jesus is drawing me into those relationships. And in fact, he goes before me and behind me and with me. And so I am not spiritually in danger when I am engaging in interfaith relationships. But it's actually, for me, it's a time of spiritual growth into who Jesus has called me to be. So one example, Shadi and we were talking about Galatians after one of these talks. And Shadi had taken the time to read the Christian book of Galatians. And for the Christians in the audience, you will know the book of Galatians has a lot to say about law and grace and the relationship between those things. And so Shadi was wrestling with these things as we all do. And, asking me these questions about how can God be both lawful and gracious? And if you just get grace, then why not do whatever you want? Sort of that classic question we get from Martin Luther. Shadi had it right there. So the thing was at that moment, I had this Muslim friend asking me, explain the grace of Jesus to me. Make sense of this to me. Now, I am a professional theologian. I have a PhD in systematic theology. I am paid to articulate the Christian faith beautifully. That's what I have to do. And I was failing in that moment because at that moment, I was overcome with the beauty of Christ's grace, and I was unable to communicate the goodness of God in that moment. And it was a powerful moment for me. So when I say that engagement with other faiths does not endanger our faith, but it actually is a space of growth, that's what I'm talking about. So it is not at all sort of this balance of be a person of profound Christian conviction, but also be nice to people. But it comes out of that. So that's how I answer that as a Christian.
Yeah, so just to add to what Matt said there, I do want to reiterate, I have a very deep appreciation for the concept of grace. And as Matt sort of conveyed there, that's been a really rich part of our friendship when I can just go to him and be like, hey, I don't fully understand this. We do have an equivalent to the word grace in Arabic. It's not as common and it's not as central theologically. So for me, it's been a little bit of a leap of faith, if you will, to try to get a better grasp on the concept of grace. And I benefited from that. But on the broader question, I would say, and I'm not sure this was Matt's intent, but I think that I can say with some level of certainty that Matt, in an indirect way, has made me a better Muslim. Um, in the sense that our conversations and learning about Christianity has made me want to look into my own religious sources more and to dig deeper. And as I mentioned, to find parallels that maybe I wasn't paying as much attention to before. And also, I think there's also something to be said, seeing what the kind of peace that religion seems to provide Matt in his own life. And he just kind of gives that aura, not to kind of like get too personal here. That is something I want to have more in my own life. And I want to find more of that through my religion, which is Islam. Um, so I think that's been really positive for me. And I think that the two can sometimes go together. As I've been more interested in finding these sources in my own religion, that's happened just as I've come to a deeper appreciation of Christianity. There are some things about Christianity that I really, really like. I'm like, this is great. This is great, but I don't have to become a Christian to appreciate those things. I don't believe in the creedal requirements of Christianity. I believe in the creedal requirements of Islam. But I can go to Christianity and learn and read and discuss and absorb and appreciate. And you can say, I think it's okay for a Muslim to say, I love this about Christianity. I think it's okay for a Christian to say, I love this about Islam. Or let's not, love is maybe a bit much. Let's not go overboard here. But hey, this is a cool idea. Oh, I like that.
This has been such a fantastic conversation. Of course, there's lots of other questions. And what I would encourage is for those of you at JBU who've been posing questions, that you would actually bring these questions into your dialogue after the event. I think Neighborly Faith provided some really great ice cream. I guess there's a really great ice cream place nearby. So we were excited to provide that just to keep the conversations going. I just want to commend both of you, though. I feel like this is not the type of interfaith discussion that people are always accustomed to hearing. I think you've showed a level of honesty and candor that I think is really refreshing and meets the moment, because we're not in a moment where we can be superficial anymore. We're in a moment where we saw over 70 million people vote for each party. And so it isn't enough, I think, to say, oh, let's just pursue unity. Like, what's holding us back? I think we actually have to think more deeply about how do we even till the ground for unity? What is prerequisite to that? And I think what's prerequisite to that is conversations like these, conversations of give and take, conversations of push and pull, where building trust, that slow building of trust that's based on honesty, that's based on a willingness to say, oh, I just think you're wrong. Or I think you're right in ways that I didn't even realize before. So I just want to thank you and commend you both for that willingness to go there. Shadi, you unmuted. Is there something you wanted to add?
No.
Okay,
No,
cool.
sorry.
I'll add something really brief.
Yeah, do it.
I think when we're talking about unity, I think it's so important in this moment. There are so many people who are calling on politicians to unite the country. And I think it's so important to recognize that politicians and states are terrible at that. Politicians are designed not to do that. And we need to stop looking to the government. And I'm speaking to my Christian brothers and sisters right now. We need to stop looking to the government to unite, to reconcile, to humble, to confess, to forgive. States don't do that. Politicians don't do that. You know, we had this amazing order in Barack Obama for 8 years, you know, and he did not unite this country. And in fact, after Obama, we had this profound division again. And so we look to politics to bind us in ways that politics just simply cannot. And it makes things, frankly, more dangerous and more difficult when we look to political leaders and pundits to pull us together, and when we lament their division.
So Shadi, Joe Biden gets up, he says, I'm going to unite the country. How do you receive that?
I mean, I support that kind of rhetoric. I don't think it's enough to just say it. There has to be, like, what does it mean to unify the country? But also, I would be a little bit cautious in the sense that there won't be, and there can't be in some sense, true unity. There will remain foundational disagreements. So if by unity we mean that we all have to, as others have said, find this almost artificial common ground and we have to dilute our commitments, that's not the unity that I'm excited about. The unity that I would support is a sense if Biden came and said, hey, we don't agree, we're not gonna agree, I'm not gonna convince you, but I wanna be the president for all Americans. And I want you to feel comfortable with me as your leader. And let's find ways to listen to each other, and let's find ways to not condemn. And if he says to his own supporters, he says, listen, you might be profoundly offended by what some Trump supporters might say. However, we are all American, and that should stand for something. That is the kind of message I think is maybe a little bit more realistic. It's not maybe as satisfying because it doesn't offer a resolution, but perhaps that's part of the answer to the question. There are no real resolutions. We simply find ways to manage conflict and to do our best in difficult situations.
Love it. So as we conclude here, there's a couple things I want to tell our audience about. Number one, we created a toolkit. If you're in the audience and you're thinking, I want to do more of this, I want to be part of these conversations more, I want to host conversations like this. Maybe you're like, I don't have a Muslim friend, or you're a Muslim, like I don't have a Christian friend. I think our toolkit will help you to really think through next steps. You can find that at neighborlyfaith.org/toolkit. Also, you saw me put in the chat, we really want to know what you think. We want to know where you stand. If you are a JBU student, please head to neighborlyfaith.org/survey. We want to know what your experiences have been like on campus. We want to know what your thoughts were on this discussion. This will help us tremendously as we bring conversations like this to Christian colleges across America. It'll help us improve our work and understand our impact. And so if you are a Protestant Christian student, you have the opportunity to win AirPods. If you are a student at JBU that does not affiliate with the Protestant majority on campus, we're going to give you $10 to $15 to Starbucks, I forget, it's one or the other, just to take the survey and tell us what your experiences has been like as someone who doesn't identify with the majority at John Brown University. So again, neighborlyfaith.org/survey. We'd love to hear from you. Let's see here. Again, if you want to know more about what's happening at John Brown this week and all the great sessions that Neighborly Faith is providing, you can head over to www.neighborlyfaith.org. We've got a whole schedule on the homepage because we've got conversations like this going on all week. So if you're really digging this and you want to learn more, please head to neighborlyfaith.org and you'll learn more. So we're going to go ahead and close. I'm going to turn it over to you, Dr. Posey.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. We just really want to say thank you for investing in this important conversation. We want to thank our speakers. Let's thank them by applauding their presentation today. So thank you. We really are appreciative of your willingness to give your time this evening. So thank you. For those of you who are in Bynum and over at the Simmons Great Hall, we have Pure Joy ice cream for you. And we would love for you to continue this conversation in your locations. And that's one way that we can do that is by sharing ice cream together. So enjoy some Pure Joy as you go. Thank you, Kevin. Neighborly Faith, thank you to Isaac for his good work as well. So we'll call it a night. Thank you.
Thanks everyone for coming.